So Wizards of the Coast just did a huge announcement yesterday where they not only announced the release schedule for the upcoming year, 2023, they also lifted the veil on what's coming up for Dungeons & Dragons. So in this video, I wanted to take a look at the playtest document they also released yesterday, which goes over character origins. And that's just the first tidbit of playtest material we got. They emphasize, of course, that this is playtest material, so it's subject to change, but I think there is a lot of interesting stuff in here. So right off the bat, I want to say that I like a lot of the changes. There are some of the changes that I am more tentative or hesitant about, but that's the whole purpose of playtesting, so that's fine. I'm not trying to sort of rag on the new edition of Dungeons & Dragons. I think it is fun that they're doing this stuff. I think it's about time that we get a revision of the core rules, and I would like to see a lot of these changes go into effect. It should also be mentioned that they say that all of this stuff is backwards compatible, which means it will be compatible with 5th edition, or at least according to Wizards of the Coast. I'm sort of dubious about that. I'm not entirely sure it's the best choice for all the rules, and I'm not entirely sure it's actually going to be true in effect. What I am happy to see though is that people like me who produce third-party content and write books for 5th edition, much of the stuff that we put in our books is not going to be affected by the changes we've heard about or seen so far. So that's a good thing in my opinion. Anyway, let's take a look at the playtest material on character origins in the upcoming generation of Dungeons & Dragons. So I have the document open here, and as you can see, it's still called Unearthed Arcana, but they did make it clear that this is for a new revision of the 2014 rules. They have gone away from calling it 5th edition, that's fine. Now they call it 2014 Player's Handbook, and they say that this material will be in the 2024 Player's Handbook. Right off the bat, we know that we're going to get character races, character backgrounds, starting languages, feats, and then a rules glossary. So one of the big changes here is that we have a determine your origin, which says that you get a race, a background, and a language. Looking at this character origin overview, you'll note that you now get a lifespan included in your race's traits, and there is no longer an ability score bonus that has been moved to the background. In most cases, I don't think this is going to matter because you can just choose which bonuses you get to your ability scores, so having it on races or on backgrounds isn't really going to make a huge difference because you can still just choose which bonuses you give. So for me, I sort of just think that we should go with a higher standard array or roll more dice when we choose our ability score, stuff like that. There's really not a need to tie it in. But of course, in the spirit of being backwards compatible, they're going to do it like this, so you can theoretically still use a race from Xanathar's Guide to Everything, even though you have the new Player's Handbook. At least I think that's the idea. So a background is going to give you your ability score bonuses, skill proficiencies, tool proficiency, language, and this is the interesting part, it's now also going to give you a starting feat. This is something we saw in the newest book, Spelljammer, Adventures in Space, or whatever it's called, where the 2 backgrounds included there gained this feat. Just right off the bat, that of course makes every other background we've gotten before not compatible, so that I have to redo all of those backgrounds. You will have to use backgrounds that now gives feat. Or there's going to be an optional rule that says, okay, if you choose a background from, let's say, Xanathar's Guide or whatever have you, you now also get to select a feat at level 1. I think that's probably the way they're going to do it. Alright, with that out of the way, let's jump directly into the different races. I'm going to go quickly through this. I'm not going to give it detailed because it is playtest. I'm just going to note what's sort of interesting about them. So the human, you now gain inspiration whenever you finish a long rest. That's obviously a change. You still gain a proficiency in 1 skill. That was sometimes at least part in some of the iterations of the human. And you also gain the skill feat or another first level feat of your choice. So the human characters are going to get a feat from the background and an additional first level feat. Now, depending on how strong first level feats are, that could be a huge bonus, but I think they've sort of done it so that the more powerful combat feats and stuff like that are going to be reserved for higher levels. So that actually takes the human's power level a bit down, and I think that's fine. But getting inspiration, getting proficiency, and getting a feat is still a very, very strong option. Of course, we still have to see what the other races are going to give you. Then we get the Artling, which are supernatural beings who are either born on the upper planes or have one or more ancestors who originated there. So it's sort of like a tiefling or an Aasimar, but in a different flavor, more or less. I'm not going to go all through all this flavor text, but suffice to say that an Artling gets angelic flight, so bonus action. And now we get to a fun part. We actually already noted it over here, but they have begun to capitalize mechanical stuff in the text. So bonus action is now capitalized, long rest is capitalized, proficiency, skill, and so on. Sort of on the fence about this. I think it's a good change overall. I think it's good to emphasize what is mechanical stuff. I like that they say bonus action, and you know, okay, this is a bonus action, because action could sometimes be ambivalent, because action can be used in a lot of different phrases, and it's not always referring to an actual mechanical action a character can take. So doing this stuff makes it more clear what is rules and what is not, and I think that's fine. What I am wary about is using it too much so the text becomes very unreadable. But I'll get into that a bit later, because there are some stuff in here that I think borders on the unreadable. So we'll talk a bit more about that later in the video. So yeah, Angelic Flight, you can fly as a bonus action. You have a Celestial Legacy where you get to pick a different animal that you sort of resemble, and you get some spells. And it's much like we've seen before, where you can cast these spells once per day, and you can use your own spell slots to also cast them. There's nothing too egregious about any of these spells. They seem fine. Thaumaturgy, Divine Favor, Lesser Restoration, and so on and so forth. And then you have resistance to radiant damage. So I think the Artling is fine. I think it's fine that it gets a limited Angelic Flight. Having these spells are nice, and damage resistance to radiant damage is also fine. The Dragonborn is of course a classic. Much like before, you get a breath weapon and you get some damage resistance related to your draconic type. You also now have dark vision. Now we have seen multiple reiterations of the breath weapon in 5e. I think this is better than the one we got in the player's handbook. It's now always a cone, so you're not just forced to take whatever has a cone. And it uses your Constitution modified proficiency bonus, blah blah. But the notable part here is it deals 1d10 plus your character level in damage. So that's a much better scaling than what we saw in the player's handbook, and it now also can be used a number of times equal to your proficiency bonus. So I think that's also fine. It's still not very powerful. It's still very situational, and I probably like it better as a bonus action. But I think it's overall an improvement, so I'm not going to hate on that. Dwarf traits, and you will note here for the dwarf that there are no sub-races in here. As far as I know, nope, no sub-races, so the dwarf is now just a single entity, and you pick up the sort of, I'm a rock, mountain dwarf, or a hill dwarf, or whatever, you pick that up and in your background. So dwarves still dark vision, dwarven resilience with the poison, you get the dwarven toughness, which was before a part of the mountain dwarf, I believe. Forge-wise, where you get a tool proficiency, and then you also still get stone cutting, but stone cutting has changed, so now it gives you tremor sense, which I think is much more usable and really fun. It's obviously not going to be used a whole lot, but whenever you're against an invisible creature, for example, having tremor sense is really good. Now there is something I think is a bit fun about Forge-wise, and that is that the creators of Dungeons & Dragons and the publisher of this playtest has said multiple times that they wanted to move away from sort of races being locked into being in a particular way, like saying all dwarves are lawful neutral or lawful good, they really like stone cutting, they're good smiths and stuff like that, because it's, I wouldn't say racist, because these are not actually human ethnicities, they are different fantasy races, so I think it's more okay to sort of shoehorn them into a specific niche. But if you say you're not going to do that anymore, you're going to put that stuff over in the background, I think a feature like Forge-wise doesn't make sense. I don't see it needing to be here. Like what if I was a dwarf who grew up in the forest and I didn't have any interest in using tools? I still have to select one of these very like smithing or constructing specific tools. So yeah, it's not that I hate that the dwarf would have this feature, it's just that I don't think it's in line with what they've said they wanted to do with the next edition of Dungeons & Dragons. So yeah, but beyond that, the dwarf is fine, it's good. I don't have any critiques beyond that. Alright, so moving on to elves, we have dark vision still, and then they choose a lineage. So this is the sub-race for the new reiteration, or at least in this playtest. And that sub-race gives them an additional feature and some spells. So the drow will get the dancing lights and dark vision increased. High elf will get prestidigitation. whatever that's called, or they can replace that cantrip with different cantrip from the arcane spell list, so that's really versatile and quite good. And the Wood Elf gets their normal standard speed increase, and also the Druidcraft cantrip, and they can get Pass Without Trace, Misty Step, Darkness. These spells are also in there, so that's fine. Fey Entity now gives advantage on saving throws you make to avoid or end the charm condition on yourself, which is actually notable because it was sort of not clear before the wording with Fey Ancestry. Now it's really clear, and I like that. Keen Senses is still in there, Proficiency and Perception, and Trance I think is mostly unchanged. Yeah, it is. So Elves, not a whole lot new there. It's basically more or less the same. Of course, we do get some spells on the Wood Elf. We do get some spells, stuff like that, some extra spells here, but that's about it. Gnomes, we have Dark Vision, we have advantage on Intelligence, Wisdom, and Charisma saving throws, period. Before it was against spells, so that's obviously a buff. I think the gnomes wanted that buff, needed that buff, so that's fine. And a Forest Gnome is more or less unchanged. They get Speak with Animals, I think that's fine. And we have Mending and Prestidigitation for Rock Gnomes and all that. Building a little critter. I'm not gonna go through this huge bunch of text to decide if it's a bit different. I think it's fine. So again, not a big change here, a minor buff for Gnomish Cunning, and that's about it. Alright, then we have the Halfling, which has the Brave feature. It had that before as well, but with the updated wording, so that's fine. Then we have Halfling Nimbleness, that is also there before. We have Luck, still works as before, and then we have Naturally Stealthy, which I think was a part of the Nature Halfling one. But again, no huge changes here. Then we get the Orc, and I should also mention with Elf, and now also with Orc, we don't have half Elf, we don't have half Orcs, because Wizards of the Coast have introduced, at least in this playtest, a new sort of text that determines that if you are a biracial, if you want to call it that, you get to select how you look and which of your ancestor traits you get. So if you're half Orc, you get to decide whether you get human traits or Orc traits. If you're half Elf, you get to decide whether you're human or elf, or if you're half Orc, half Elf, you get to decide between those two, and so on and so forth. For me, I don't know if I like this change. I kind of liked that half Elves, half Orc, stuff like that was their own category and sort of mix between the two races. But it's not like I hate it either, because it's more of a cosmetic thing. I think maybe I would like a system where you could sort of just select different and tie them together, but that would mean that all races would have to be really well balanced against each other, which could be difficult. So say you could take the one Orc trait and one Elf trait, then you have to ensure that all traits are created equal and stuff like that, so you can't just mix and match and make something completely overpowered. It's something that'll take a while to put together, and maybe it's not in line with the spirit of Dungeons & Dragons. So yeah, but that was just a quick aside about that. The Orc gets some Adrenaline Rush, where they can get temporary hit points. That's a new feature. And the dash action, they get Dark Vision as before, and then they have a powerful build, and they have their Relentless Endurance still. So not much has changed there, besides Adrenaline Rush being a bit different than Aggressive. I think they might have had before in some iteration of it, but nothing too interesting here, I think. Tieflings, they are divided now into legacies, where they have different spells and stuff they get. So you have either Chthonic, Infernal, and of course Abyssal, and they give different spells. Where is the table for that? Okay, it's at the bottom here, sorry. Yeah, so we have a table right here, and they give some resistance to different types of damage, and they get, of course, some different spells they can cast, much like the Elf, for example. So again, it's a change, of course, and I think it's nice to have that versatility in the core rules, Abyssal, Infernal, Chthonic, but nothing too much has changed here, in my opinion. Moving on to backgrounds. Backgrounds have obviously become a lot more interesting now that they also give out feats, but I think it's important to note here that we get a build your background section, and that's the first thing we get. It's not an optional rule, it's the primary rule, that you can build your own background, where you can basically determine which ability scores you increase, which skill proficiencies you get, which one tool proficiency you get, and one language you get. And also what first level feat you get, and your equipment. So this means that basically the backgrounds that they've put together for us are sample backgrounds, as we always also told here. And I think it's a very good way to do it. It's also the way that we already do it in my game. I don't care what background you select. I just let my players decide this thing, get your tool proficiency, your language, your whatever, and then they can call their background whatever they want. They cannot have a background. They'll just have those features, and of course write me a background about the character, so I know about the character. So I think that's a good way to do it, and that's also why I don't think it's too important to go through these sample backgrounds, because they are sample backgrounds. It's good to have them for newer players. I think it's very nice that newer players can just go in and say, okay, I'm an acolyte, I don't need to sort of select all this stuff I don't know about. But beyond that, from a veteran player or DM perspective, they're not that interesting because they are optional. So just to summarize on the whole race and background aspect, I think, again, moving ability scores increases, doesn't really matter if you can just select whatever you want. Moving the feat doesn't really matter, you can just select whatever you want. Whether you put that in background or put that in race, it's not going to change your game when you can sort of just select whatever you want. But yeah, I think it's fine, and I think it's fine that all backgrounds get this feat, all characters get this first level feat, if the first level feats are very well balanced against each other, and I have a sneaking suspicion that they aren't. I have of course looked ahead in the document, so I know that some of them aren't, in my opinion, born equal, but we'll quickly go through them. So here we have the alert feat, which of course was also present in the player's handbook, and it's been sort of debuffed and buffed, where the bonus to initiative now follows the proficiency bonus, and you can also swap initiative. I think swapping initiative should be part of the standard rules. I think it's fine for characters to sort of swap the initiative, and this is of course debuff because most campaigns are not going to go beyond 10 levels, so you're gonna be at that +4 bonus probably at your highest, and I think that's fine because the alert feat was really strong before. So yeah, a fine change, but it is still a very good feat in my opinion. And then we have Crafter, which is an interesting feat. It can give you a discount on buying stuff, you can craft faster, and you also get some tool proficiencies. Again, this is a non-combat feat, and I sort of wanted maybe all first level feats to be non-combat feats, because you get them for free and they're supposed to maybe make your character more interesting. And we all know that power gamers, or just people who are interested in being powerful, are gonna select powerful feats as soon as they can. So I would sort of want these first level feats to be all non-combat options. But for now, there's nothing that's too powerful, because the alert feat has been nerfed at early levels at least. So healer is vastly debuffed, because it now uses your allies' hit dice when you use it, but it is improved when it comes to the healing rerolls, where you can basically reroll any roll of 1 when you use healing or restore hit points with a spell, or with this field battle medic benefit. So I think that's nice. That's actually much more usable also for a caster healer, which most healers are. So I think that's fine. And then we have the lucky feat, which has always been a very powerful feat in my opinion. They're not tied to your proficiency bonus, which is of course a minor nerf at the first 4 levels. But beyond that, it's going to get stronger. You're going to have more luck points than before. So it's basically unchanged, except that you potentially get more uses, and I think that makes it more powerful. One important thing to note here is the use of this terminology, D20 test. And this is, we're going to get explained later, this means any ability check, saving throw, or attack roll. They're just going to write D20 test. And I do not like this change, because when you emphasize stuff like luck points or proficiency bonus, that's a nice way to show people these are mechanical terms. You should look them up, or you should know what they are. We're talking mechanical stuff now, makes sense. But when you use stuff like D20 test, I think it sort of creates a barrier for newer players, because it's not very intuitive what it means, and it's something that looks very gamey. It just looks gamified, and I always had an issue with 4th edition, because the stat blocks and character class and stuff like that were so hard to read, because they've gone so far into making it gamified and just writing +4 squares, bump, stuff like that, which makes it really hard for newer players to get into the game. One of the nice things about 5th edition, and why it's attracted so many new players, I think, beyond a million other reasons, is that much of the text is readable even for people who doesn't know the rule for Dungeons & Dragons. They may not understand everything, but they can read the prose. It can make sense for them. even if they don't know exactly what an action is or what it means to be stunned, they can read a spell and realize, okay, this is a spell that stuns people. So that sort of makes the rules of Dungeons & Dragons more approachable. And when you do stuff like writing D20 test and capitalize too many words, you are at risk at making the game less accessible for newer players. Again, I can see the need to not write attack, roll, ability check, and saving throw every time you want to do this, but maybe it's better to just say a D20 roll, for example, because you know rolling a dice what that means, and then you can always declare in the rules somewhere what a roll means. So it's more about the wording necessarily than combining these three different kinds of rolls into one. So that's the minor side. I do like that they are capitalizing stuff. I don't want them to overdo it. I don't want them to make the game less approachable and accessible for newer players, because that will kill the game faster than anything else. So yeah, more feats here. We get the musician, inspiring song, instrument training, stuff like that. You can give some inspiration to people. That's fine. And savage attacker. I'm actually interested about this because it was not very good. When you take the attack action and hit the target with the weapon as part of the action, you can roll the weapon's damage twice and use either roll against the target. So that's exactly the same as before, and I still think it's an underwhelming feat in my opinion. Especially because it's meant for martial classes, and martial classes are typically going to get more attacks, and you're still only doing this once per turn, so it's like, okay. Skilled, it's just 3 skills as before. One thing we should note here is that it is repeatable, which is fun, so you can actually take this feat multiple times. We have that on Magic Initiate as well, stuff like that. I would probably have allowed a character to take skilled multiple times in 5e as well, but now we get it as a clear-cut thing in the rules, and I think that's nice, and that's fine, especially for stuff like skilled. Then we have Tavern Brawler. I'm not gonna go deep into the mechanics here. Basically, it's gotten better because you can do a lot more stuff with it now, and that's good because Tavern Brawler was a horrific feat before. It was, in my opinion, only usable on a very specific niche build that wanted to do some particular stuff with unarmed strikes. And then we have Tough, which is still just increasing your maximum hit points by 2 per level. And this sort of emphasizes why I'm not a huge fan of the way they've structured first level feats, because having that Tough feat is just so good. Obviously, it's not as good as level 1 as it is at level 5, but it will very quickly get good. At level 5, you have 10 more hit points than everyone else in the party that didn't take the Tough feat, which means that you'll probably have 20-25% more hit points than everyone else, and this is a significant buff in my opinion. And I think we would see a lot of players just picking up the Tough feat, and I think that's not fun, because it sort of hurts feats like Musician and feats like Crafter and other stuff like that we would maybe want characters to take more. So I think they should sort of take out some of the feats that are just plain martial or plain combat oriented, and put in more feats that really speak more to your abilities outside of combat and who you are as a person for first level feats. That's at least my opinion. Alright, so here we have the rules glossary, and while it's not maybe as exciting to read as character races and backgrounds and stuff like that, it's also where we learn a lot about the next, let's call it generation of Dungeons & Dragons, as the creators do. So I think it's really interesting to go through this stuff and sort of see what's in here. Arcane spells is our first hint that they have changed something about spells, because previously you would just have spells, you would have different schools of spells, but now they've also divided them into different types of spells. This is something we had in 3.5 or in 3rd edition, and something that I've been really missing in 5th edition, because there's points in time where I want to say this effect is only, or this environment or something is going to do something to divine spells, but not arcane spells, in the terms that arcane spells are bards, sorcerers, warlocks, wizards, stuff like that. Divine spells are clerics and druids and whatever it is. We'll see as we go through it. But I think that's really nice to have them codified in this manner, so you can have effects that only interact with different types of spells. Really nice change. I love this. I hope they stick with it. I don't necessarily agree exactly with how they've divided which classes use different types of spells, but that's something that can always be adjusted and not something that's a huge issue for me. What I really love is that they make this distinction, because it allows for so much more fun stuff in the way we build the rules and magic items and encounters, monsters, all that stuff. Really like it. Artisan's Tools, not gonna read a whole lot about that. Creature types, we have 0 new creature types, which is quite good because that would really not be backwards compatible if they started changing these around. So sticking to the creature types we've always had is good. I like that. And then we have this D20 test rules text, which are ability checks, attack rolls, and saving throws. Again, I don't mind that they lump these together. I think they just need to call it something else than a D20 test. It sounds very, very gamey for me. You may disagree. Please let me know in the comments if you do. And while you're down there, please also subscribe to the channel, like the video, stuff like that. For all of this stuff, I'm interested to hear what your opinion is. And maybe if you disagree with me, that's fine. We can have a discussion, a nice, polite discussion in the comments. So for the D20 test, it's also made clear that the DM determines whether it's even viable to make a D20 test, as it always has been and always should be. And it must have a DC between 5 and 30. 30 is... I can't remember setting a DC higher than 30, although I have wanted to a lot of times, because when you play with a bard with expertise and 22 charisma, for example, who's rolling a minimum of something like 19 on their persuasion checks, 30 can feel quite easy. But I think it's fine. I think generally if something is harder than 30, it just shouldn't be possible at all. So I think that's perfectly fine. Then we have rolling a 1. If you roll a 1 on the D20 test automatically fails, regardless of any modifiers to the roll. So now you can actually net fail, or what you call it, a critical fail on ability checks, attack rolls, and saving throws. Before it was only attack rolls, as far as I believe. Now it also goes for ability checks and saving throws. This is one of the rules that I could see being controversial, because there are some situations where characters shouldn't fail, but I've always been of the mind that if something is so easy for a character, let's say you have that level 10 fighter with a plus 11 or something to athletics, and you want them to climb up a wall, and you give that wall a DC of 10 and they roll a 1, they fall down. Maybe don't have them roll at all. Generally, I don't do very, very easy rolls or very, very difficult rolls. So I think this is a fine change. It's mostly how we've played it in our games anyway, and I think that's also what Wizard has picked up on, that most people always consider 1 a fail and 20 a success, and it's more about when you give out these sort of D20 tests, because sometimes stuff is just impossible. So yeah. For me, not very controversial. For some tables, I could see this being controversial. The same goes for rolling 20, just in the other direction. So if you roll 20, it's always a success. What I think is interesting here is that a player character also gains inspiration when rolling the 20 thanks to the remarkable success. So when you roll a 20, you get advantage, which means you have an easier time rolling a 20 and blah, blah, blah. It could be fun. It's fun how they're playing around with the inspiration system. You can still only have 1 inspiration. We'll get to that later. So it's sort of limited, like in that. But this can be quite a game changer, I think, especially if you get to roll a lot of D20s for stuff. I could see this being abused, where you have some ability or some cantrip you can cast. Basically, you can go down and firebolt a rock until you roll a 20, and now you have your inspiration back before the next encounter. So I'm not sure that I'm a huge fan of this change, because it is really abusable. And of course, the DM can just say, you can't do that, I won't allow that, but the DM shouldn't have to do that. That should be just not possible within the given rules, in my opinion. Moving on, we have critical hits, which have now been limited to weapons and unarmed strikes. Very notable, spells can no longer critical hit, so a spell attack can't be a critical hit. This is of course a nerf to spellcasters, and it's intentional. As far as we've heard from the creators, they want to sort of give martial classes a bit of a power boost, and I think that's warranted. But I do have an issue with it, because they actually nerf martial classes a bit further down text, so you'll read along. So if you roll a 20, you also do a critical hit, which deals extra damage to the target. You roll the damage dice of the weapon or unarmed strike a second time, and add the second roll as extra damage to the target. But the change here is that you do not add the extra damage of anything else to the critical hit. So your sneak attack is not getting doubled, your divine smites are not getting doubled. Still, I think it's a nerf to both spellcasters that they can't crit on spell attacks, but it's also a nerf to martial characters, especially rogues and paladins and stuff like that, who would get a lot of extra damage dice to the hits. So I don't necessarily like this change. I think if they're gonna do this, I think they should do something else for those characters, or they should specify, for example, in the rogue sneak attack, that their dice are doubled when they crit. That would be a fine way to do it. So go in and say and identify the places where this is gonna hurt a character a lot, and say, okay, you override the standard rule. But again, I probably just want critical hits to be available to all classes and all attacks, because it's also fun to throw a firebolt and crit on that. It also makes sense that that can be a critical hit, so maybe they should just find another way to increase or decrease the gap between martial and spellcasting characters, in my opinion. Alright, moving on, we have divine spells. Those are reserved for clerics and paladins, which means that druids are gonna land in another box, which are primal, I think it's called. I think that's fine, that's classical. Clerics and paladins, those are divine spells, makes sense. Gaming set, not so interesting. Grappled is interesting because that has been changed a lot. So speed, your speed is 0 and can't change. You have disadvantage on attack rolls against any target other than the grappler. This is really interesting, and I quite like this change. I think it's fun that you now use grapple to sort of make it easier or make it harder for an enemy to attack your allies. It makes grapple more than just reducing move speed. It actually makes it something that can be used in combat to affect the battle more than just movement. So I really like this change. I would probably have added in that you have the disadvantage on attack rolls against any target other than grappler, and maybe also attacks with weapons that aren't light, for example, because I've always found it sort of interesting that you can still wield your greatsword effectively in very close quarters. And I know medieval knights would just grab the blade and sort of smash with it, stuff like that. But if you are actually grappling, like wrestling on the ground type of grappling, then a dagger would obviously be easier to hit someone with than a greatsword or a lance or what have you. So I think they could sort of play around with that. But I like this. It's a step in the right direction, in my opinion. We're also told that the grappler can drag or carry you, but the grappler suffers a slow condition, and I love that there's a slow condition. We'll get to that. And while moving, unless you are tiny or 2 or more sizes smaller than the grappler. Really fun, really great. I probably would have gone with 1 size smaller. I think that would make sense. But in any event, I think it's fine that they add in some extra text here, and I love that you get that slowed condition. And then there is escape, which has also changed significantly, because while grapple, you can make a dexterity or strength saving throw against the grapple's escape DC at the end of each of your turns, and then you get out of the grapple. The condition also ends if the grapple is incapacitated or if something moves you outside the grapple's range without using your speed. So now you can automatically escape a grapple at the end of your turns, ending the condition on yourself on a success. I like that you can automatically get out of the grapple. I think that's fine, but I'm not entirely sure that I like that it sort of just happens automatically. What if you are stunned? Can you still do this? There's nothing to tell me that I can't, because it's not an action, it's not a reaction, it's not just something that I can do. So I could basically be stunned and grappled, and I can get out of the grapple even though I'm stunned. So I think there needs some clarification here. And then it also means that, as far as I can tell, we can't get out of the grapple condition unless we do this at the end of a turn. But it does say here that if the grappler is incapacitated or if something moves you outside the grapple's range without using your speed. So if, for example, and we'll see that later, you can shove the grappler away just like you could in 5e, does that mean you can just get out of your grapple, so you can still just make shoves, or someone else can shove the grappler or shove you, and you can automatically not resist that, then you're out of the grapple? I think there is some rules clarification that we will probably want on this, but I'm not sure that I hate it. It's something that I would really want to see play tested before I know exactly how I feel about it and how it works out in combat. I could see it being a nerf. I could see it being a buff for grappling, not sure. Incapacitated has gotten some clarification, so it's actions or reactions, which means, I guess, that you can take bonus actions, because actions should now refer to only actual actions and not bonus actions. So for me, this is a bit weird. Can take actions, reactions. Is bonus actions just, is that an oversight, or is it supposed to be that you can take bonus actions? Anyway, your concentration broken, it already was, but we didn't get that mentioned in the incapacitated condition in Player's Handbook. That was mentioned in the spell, I think, spellcasting part of the book. Speakless, you can't speak, and you have disadvantage on the roll and roll initiative, so that makes sense. If you're sleeping at the start of combat, you have disadvantage. Sure. Alright, inspiration. When you have inspiration, you can expend it to give yourself advantage on D20 test, and you gain inspiration by rolling a 20 for a D20 test, and you can also get inspiration when you do something that's particularly heroic or amusing, so it's still something that's left up to the DM. And I think I'm ambivalent about it, because I think it's fine to sort of encourage good role-playing, encourage epic actions, but it's also just dangerous to leave it up to the DM. I know that personally I'm either I'll give out a lot of inspiration or I'll forget about it often, and that's why I think it's easier to have it codified, but at least there is a way for characters to get it now that doesn't rely on the DM actually deciding to give it out. So I think that's probably a decent change here. You can only have one inspiration at a time, but you can give it to another player in your group if you lack inspiration. So once again, you can go out into the woods, you can throw 1,000 fire bolts at a rock until you have given the entire party inspiration. And I don't think that's how it's supposed to be, but that is the rules as written in this document. So that's something they need to take a look at, I think. And if you still have inspiration, if you start a long rest, you lose that inspiration. And that encourages people to use it. I think that's fine. So long rest, slightly changed that a rest is interrupted by combat or by 1 hour walking, casting spells, similar activity, it confers no benefit. So now you can no longer just fight and then get back to your long rest. You have to restart the long rest. And you gain the benefit of a short rest instead. That's the only time we get a short rest mentioned, I think. Or one of the very few times at least. So you can't benefit from a long rest in more than a 24-hour period, blah, 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 and you must have at least 1 hit point to get its benefits. Not a huge change here, but I think it's nice to get this clarified. Musical instruments, not as interesting primal spells. Those are for druids and rangers. That makes sense. It's just nature stuff. And then we get to something really interesting, in my opinion, and that is the slowed condition. A new condition for Dungeons & Dragons. I've wanted a new condition for so long. We've made the staggered condition sort of unofficially in some of the content we produce. We always write it out, of course, because no one knows what staggered mean. Basically, it means that you can either take an action, bonus action, or move on your turn, and you can't take reactions. So you're sort of like Daisy staggered, can't do everything. And I think it's a really fun condition because it limits the players' characters without incapacitating them fully. But they've gone a different direction with slowed, which means that you are basically, your speed is halved, and you have attack rolls against you have advantage, and you have disadvantages on dexterity saving throws. My only issue with this condition is that it doesn't infer any disadvantage on your attacks or what you can do on your turn, whereas the slowed spell or the slow spell did so. Spellcasters could sort of fail casting spells that cost an action, and martial classes obviously couldn't make more than 1 attack with their attack action and stuff like that. It was also very long and complicated to read, so this is of course a lot cleaner, but I think that maybe being slowed would incur disadvantage on attacks, or maybe just that you can only take an action or a bonus action in turn instead of both. I think that would be a nice addition to the condition, which would also make it more even across the board, because it's not just disadvantage on attack rolls, it's you have to choose between the action and the bonus action. I think that would be a nice touch. Tremor I don't believe that's true change, it's just clarified a bit. And then we have unarmed strikes, which have been changed quite a bit, because you always have proficiency, strength modifier plus proficiency bonus. I think that was also the case before, actually. This is also the same, and you must now use an unarmed strike to grapple. Before it was just something you did as an attack. Instead of attacking, you grappled. Now you just hit with the unarmed strike, and instead of dealing damage, the target becomes grappled, and they have an escape DC. So where before you had to make this strength contest versus dexterity, stuff like that, to determine whether or not the target became grappled, now it's done in a different way, where if you just hit that attack, they are grappled, and they will automatically get out on the next turn, or they can try to shove you away by making their own unarmed strike on their turn. So it sort of changes the dynamic on a grapple. It also makes it so that you can no longer take expertise in strength athletics and really always succeed on your grapple. Now you have to hit the target with an attack, which of course, unless they change the rules, is never going to be something you have expertise in or gain significant plus to hit in. I think I possibly like this change, although it seems like a nerf to the grapple intensive builds. It is hard to say. Again, it's something we'll need to playtest a bit. And lastly, we have the spell list. I'm not going to go through all of these. These are just 0 level spells and 1st level spells. What you will note, and which I think is good, is that Healing Word, for example, is both a divine spell and a primal spell. So you'll still get that stuff on different classes. Notably, the Bard is an arcane caster and Healing Word is a divine spell. So does it mean the Bard loses Healing Word? Possibly. So there's some stuff in there that can obviously affect the game, but it's hard to say for sure exactly how the class is going to play out yet. We're going to get that, I think, in an upcoming playtest document. So that's my review of the new Unearthed Arcana playtest for the upcoming reiteration of Dungeons & Dragons, the next generation or the next edition or whatever you call it. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff in here. I think that it's mostly positive for me. I think they do a lot of clarification. They have some nice touches. I like the stuff that they do with gating feats to 1st level and stuff like that. I think there's some buttons they need to tweak, then some numbers they need to crunch, and some stuff they need to get more right. But overall, I think that the changes they are proposing here are mostly good changes. Now, there is a larger discussion as to whether or not they're doing enough, or whether or not they're doing too much. Are they moving too far that it won't be backwards compatible in reality? Are they not doing enough, so they're not fixing some of the really core issues of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition? I have some gripes. I've made a previous video about what I would like to see changed, and I haven't seen any indication that they are necessarily going to change those things. But we have a lot yet to see, so I think it's too early to determine that. If you have any opinions or just want to ask something about the stuff you've seen here, please let me know in the comments down below. I would love to talk about these upcoming changes to everyone's favorite role-playing game in the comments down below. Please also remember to like and subscribe to the channel, and if you want to support what we do here and help us make videos such as these without annoying, unskippable mid-rolls and all that stuff, please consider becoming a patron over at patreon.com/Eventyr, where we also put out new encounters for Dungeons & Dragons 3 times per month, and you get access to a whole archive of that stuff and a lot of other cool stuff. So yeah, beyond that, there's not a whole lot left to say, except thank you so much for watching, and I hope that I'll see you in the next video.